Well, joining me to discuss whether MPs should or will block the next stage of the Brexit bill are Hilary Benn, Chair of the Brexit Select Committee, and John Whittingdale, Conservative MP and member of that committee. And of course, Hilary Benn, you in Labour, you voted against the second reading, so presumably, unless there are very radical changes, you will go on opposing.
Well, let's take it a stage at a time. I think the government was left in no doubt by the 2 days of debate that it's going to have to change this bill. And we saw some indications of that from David Lidington last night in his wind-up speech. And what is crucial now, the amendments that have been put down. I've put down one that says that the government cannot make regulations to implement the withdrawal agreement until both houses of Parliament have had a vote on it. Now, David Davis said to me on Thursday that he would think about it. I think that is essential, and as I understand it, Dominic Grieve and the Labour front bench have put down a number of amendments too, because there were concerns expressed on all sides of the House about the nature of the powers the government was proposing to take unto itself. And I think the bill will come out of committee looking rather different from how it looks today.
John Whittingdale, you strong backer of leaving the European Union. Do you think this bill needs to be improved?
Well, this bill is absolutely essential. Without it, there would be chaos, because we are leaving the European Union, and unless we pass this bill, there will be huge areas where there is simply no law, which nobody wants to see, and it will create maximum uncertainty. So I find the general position of the Labour Party in opposing the bill in its entirety utterly extraordinary, which is why people like Karen Flint, who is certainly not a Leave supporter, couldn't support the bill.
But I mean, do you think, though, that they does need some pretty fundamental changes?
David Davis, right from the very beginning of the debate on the bill, made it clear that he wanted to listen to Parliament. I'm all in favour of parliamentary scrutiny. It's one of the reasons why I supported Leave, was because I was completely...
Because that's what the irony is about.
I was completely opposed to the fact that huge amounts of British law was being made without
come back to Parliament.
The difference, though, was that the European Union was making laws which took instant effect without parliamentary scrutiny. This is intended not to change law at all. It is to make sure there is continuity. And Parliament will have a lot of opportunity, both to look at the detail of this bill, but also then, if there is any change, that will obviously require Parliament.
But as you say, it's a massive task, perhaps rather bigger than people were led to believe when it was first announced. Do you support this idea of triage, of Parliament having committees to consider whether something needs further consideration or not?
Well, one of the things which I'm very anxious is that this process must be completed relatively quickly. We need to not only have this bill in place before we leave, but we need to have all the statutory instruments that follow on from it also approved by the time that we come to leave. Otherwise, there is this gap.
So speed rather than accuracy is important.
Both obviously are desirable.
Yeah. But what about having then a triage?
Well, that is certainly something which I suspect the government will consider. If it is felt that it would improve...
Would you vote for Dominic Grieve's amendment?
Well, I want to look at Dominic Grieve's amendment, and I want to hear the government's response.
Will you vote for Dominic Grieve's amendment?
I think we do have to have a triage, a system, a sifting process, because there's all the world of difference between a straightforward transposition. You delete the word "the Commission," you substitute the Secretary of State for whatever, and the legislation remains the same, compared to really big questions. We have a legal requirement to meet air quality standards. Currently, the Commission is responsible for that, can go to the European Court of Justice. Which body in Britain is the government going to give it to? What powers will that body have? And will we, as ordinary citizens, have the ability to hold people to account? But as your question rightly implied, Adam, it's hardly taking back control for the government to say we want to give ourselves the power by secondary legislation to amend any Act of Parliament, including the bill that is now going to go into committee. And the point was made over the 2 days of debate. Ministers say, look at all the safeguards that we have set out here in this bill, but elsewhere in the bill they're giving themselves the power by secondary legislation to change the terms of the bill, which means that the safeguards in theory, wouldn't be there in the future. And that's a fundamental problem with the bill, which is why we voted in the way that we did last night.
That?
But we are leaving the European Union.
Safeguards are false.
But equally, no, I don't accept that. The Secretary of State was very clear that anything which did represent a significant change to the law would be subject to much greater scrutiny. This bill and the statutory instruments are intended to ensure there is no change in law. Now, Hillary's example is absolutely right. If involves the creation of an entirely new body which doesn't exist at the moment, and that would need much greater parliamentary involvement than just a 1.5 hour negative or even a negative resolution which doesn't get any debate.
How do you feel about the Labour MPs, 7 Labour MPs who voted with the Conservatives last night?
They have a long-standing view that they hold about our position in the European Union.
Well, Caroline doesn't.
No,
She abstained. There.
No, she did abstain. That is true. And look, the charge came from the Conservative side. If you don't vote for this bill, you are somehow undermining Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Now, that is not the case, not least because David Davis said in moving the second reading of the bill, this bill is not about leaving the European Union. We took that decision when we decided to trigger Article 50. I voted for that, Remainer, but I accept the outcome of the referendum. So we need to focus now on the powers that the government is proposing to give itself, and a bill is needed. Our reservation was we thought this bill wasn't up to scratch.
And the reason why I asked, because it could be quite significant to Labour's position, because the people who voted against were people, including you know, people on the left of the party like Kate Hoey and others. And on social media this morning, some of the Corbyn supporters are actually saying they should be deselected.
Look, people
like Dennis Skinner.
People have long-standing views. We are a broad church in the Labour Party. Long may we continue to be a broad church. But the Labour Party's position is absolutely clear. We think this bill was fundamentally flawed. We will now seek to amend it. The real issue now is, once this legislation question is sorted, is where we're going to end up when the negotiations conclude.
Are you really taking this position because you want to stop or delay Brexit?
No, because we will leave the European Union at the end of March 2019. That is not in doubt. The really big question now, given the state that the negotiations are in, and they really are in a state, is the government is going to have to accept, since it will be impossible to negotiate the kind of comprehensive, bespoke deal the government has talked about since the referendum result. Nobody thinks that's going to happen. We will end up with transitional arrangements, and they will include staying in a single market and a customs union and continuing to make payments.
Do you accept there's going to be a transition period?
Yes, I think there will be a transitional period, but
2 years?
what I want to make sure is that it is a transition and not a permanent new arrangement. I would like to see a distinct date set for the end of the transition, and it being very clear that we are moving to a new arrangement which is outside the EU.
But it would be a
transition
market during which there would be a question mark as to what the ultimate destination was going to be.
No, I mean, I think...
be for negotiation, wouldn't it?
Well, obviously the ultimate destination is something which will have to be negotiated through arrangements.
Yeah, but and that is Norway, for example.
Well, I hope it isn't Norway, because I don't think Norway enjoys any of the advantages which we will get by leaving. No, well, actually, the Secretary said, well, actually, in response to a question from me last week, David Davis said that he did not accept that Norway was a viable option for the UK.
Do you think Norway is alive as a transition, or indeed a long-term
I think there's a long way to go on this, because the government has had to move from its original position, no, we don't need transitional arrangements, it'll all be jolly easy, Europe will be desperate to give us a good deal, to where we are now, where the negotiations are bogged down. And the real question is this: how do we avoid damage for British industry and British jobs? That's why the government has been forced to move in the direction of Labour's position that there will have to be transitional arrangements, and then it depends on the nature of the deal. Now, at that point, the issue is this: do we want to return to tariffs? No, we don't. How do we secure tariff-free trade? How do we avoid the return of obstacles to trade, rules of origin, and all of those things? And that is why those negotiations, after we've left, to get a new relationship, will be of huge importance.
And what do you understand Labour's official position on this to be? Because there has been change over the summer. Is Labour now open to Britain remaining in the single market beyond the transition period?
Keir Starmer has said very clearly that the transition, we remain in the single market and a customs union, and he said we should leave on the table what happens in the future. Now, in relation to the single market, certainly my view is the electorate did send us a message about free movement. There is an issue there, and I accept that. But in the end, what matters is the outcome for our economy, our ability to trade, to attract foreign investment, to secure and grow the number of jobs in the UK. And one should be less worried about the means. It's the ends, as Keir Starmer always says, that really matter.
Would you leave the single market on the table through the transition period and perhaps beyond?
Well, I mean, I'm very clear that one of the reasons people voted to leave was because they want to regain control over movement and our own laws, and those are not compatible with membership of the single market. Now, if it takes a degree of time before we can be outside of the single market and no longer subject to those requirements, I will accept that. But that has to be where we are heading.
But doesn't the fact that you want to keep it on even for a transition period, or will contemplate keeping it on transition period, suggest that it may not be such a good idea after all to...
No, not at all. What I do accept, however, is that it's very important we have new arrangements in place to allow us to trade with as little impediment as possible outside of the single market. We get access, but we are no longer members. But that is something which is going to have to be part of the negotiation.
Any chance at the end of this you'll both be in the same lobby voting for this?
Well, I find that slightly hard to believe. But look, in relation to this bill, it depends whether the government, if the government moves to deal with all of the objections that we raised, not just about the powers, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, protecting workers' rights, devolution. There's a whole list of issues that have been raised over the last 2 days of debate. And the question now is the government going to listen to what Parliament says?
So you could back it on those circumstances?
Well, let's see if the government moves.
OK, thank you both very much indeed.